Mercantilism and its impact on the world. Mercantilism was a way for European colonial empires such as the Spanish, Portuguese, British, and French to expand their reach and gain wealth during the early parts of colonization. It heavily benefited the European colonial empires in terms of wealth, and though that wealth was exported to them by their colonies. Mercantilism also imposed an imbalanced system of trade, which benefited the colonial empires. And from mercantilism, the mother colonies were able to take advantage of the people in the Americas pretty much for their own benefit.
Europeans based their colonial strategies on an economic theory known as mercantilism. This ensured that governments served the economic interests of their countries by importing and exporting various materials such as silver, gold, precious metals, and tobacco. This viewpoint was able to fuel wars between Europeans and the various colonial rivals around the world. Empires arose within the colonies, and many differences stemmed from the differentiating societies of the colonizing powers. And this meant that many men and women experienced colonial intrusion in various ways. However, enslaved Native American and African women were higher in demand and were transferred to many new colonial rulers. For example, this was seen when Cortez sealed his alliance with the city of against the Aztecs by an exchanging of gifts, where Cortez received hundreds of women whom he distributed among his peers and soldiers.
Tlaxcala is the name of that city there, Tlaxcala. All right.
Carson?
Carson. Carson.
Where is Carson? Carson, you there? McPherson?
Daniel, do you want to read it, or should I just read it?
I'll just read it since.
Right.
The effect on the Native American population. When the settlers sent by various empires arrived in the Americas, most notably the Spanish, the natives and the slaves brought along had to deal with the harsh changes. Many native women were distributed amongst the Spanish men and married them, which was encouraged. Some came out quite profitable, actually, from the situation, but others were abused and demanded to do sexual acts almost constantly, and their original men couldn't help them. So pretty much the native women there were taken advantage of by the invaders. This torment was acted upon both natives and the slaves, and even more notably, the native families had to give daughters to the Spanish. And that's the presentation.
Go.
So it's Aztecs and the Incas by Ivan, James, Zach, and Cage. The Aztecs, known for their agricultural capabilities, ability to cultivate nearly all lands available, irrigation, complex calendar system, hieroglyphic writings, and their pyramids and temples, the Aztecs were a Mesoamerican civilization that flourished in central Mexico from 1300 to 1521. The Aztecs, through their power and wealth, were actually able to drive out the conquistadors from the capital of Tenochtitlan, but were then stopped by when their enemy, the Tlaxcalans, forged an alliance with the conquistadors. In the pictures in the bottom, you can see some of their hieroglyphic writings, their early forms of irrigation, and one of their many famous temples, pyramids.
The Incas. The Incan Empire was the largest empire in pre-Columbian America. The empire began in 1438 and fell in 1533. The administrative, political, and military center of the empire is located in the city of Cusco. The Incas were a warrior-like people. They also practiced human sacrifice. They were conquered by Francisco Pizarro. Pizarro was a fierce conquistador who led the conquest of Peru. The Incas are also known for building huge temples and monuments. They also were pretty wealthy. In the bottom right, you'll see a picture of Francisco Pizarro. And then in the left-hand corner, you see some of the Incan architecture. And then in the middle, there is a map of their territory.
How the Aztecs and Incas were alike. The Aztecs and Incas both were conquered by the Spanish, and that led to a dozen of major cities and universities and, well, Christianity in South America and Mexico. They were also subject to having their religious ideologies being taken away from them by the Spaniards and the Christian zealots who had come over at the time. During this time, almost all the labor done was from a forced labor system known as encomienda, I think. Yeah. It was probably the closest thing to slavery that they could find. Both of these indigenous peoples were subject to gross abuse and exploitation due to their level in the social hierarchy, which was the very lowest. Prior to being overtaken by the Spanish conquest, both nations were incredibly wealthy due to their agriculture and gold supply. So that's my slide.
Okay.
Differences between the Aztecs and the Incas. The Aztecs had a larger supply of agricultural goods compared to the Incas. The Aztecs also had better tools for agriculture. The Incas were better at fighting, and they had a bigger armies than most other groups. The Incas were much larger than the Aztecs as well. When doing human sacrifices, the Aztecs would commit cannibalism. However, the Incas did not.
Okay. Awesome. Abdu.
All right, can you see it?
Yep.
All right. Hold on, let me minimize this. All right, is everything good? All right.
Looks good.
Colonies of Sugar. It's by Griffin, Sebastian, and Gabe, and me.
The European uses of sugar. It was used as a sweetener, a spice, a medicine, a sculptural form, and a preservative. Next slide, Christian. The Arabs pioneered a large scale of sugar. They learned new techniques and how to transfer it. They transferred it from the Atlantic islands and then to the Americans. Portuguese planters dominated in the world market in sugar. The British turned the Caribbean into highly productive sugar cane or sugar producing colonies. And the sugar market transformed Brazil. Next slide.
Slave conditions. Slaves working on sugar estates had horrible conditions. More male slaves rather than female slaves were reported from Africa. And because of this led to gender imbalances and many other economic issues. Women made up half of the field gangs because of this and did hard work that men usually did, such as planting and growing crops. And so basically because of that, the crops weren't growing as good and economically it wasn't going as good because they weren't used to this and men would usually be doing it. And they were also subject to the same brutal punishments as their past male workers if they couldn't get the job done. And they used music and made up languages to communicate in this time because reading was prohibited as a slave. Also, talking in it because they were afraid they would run away. And the use of African slave labor made colonies very diverse and ethics grew. So, for example, in the French Caribbean, the population was controlled by 93% of African Americans. And this was very quick because about 100 years before that, it was all white. So it was very different.
Racial mixing. Mulattoes, a person of mixed white and black ancestry, especially a person with one white and one black parent. Considerable amount of racial mixing took place in colonial Brazil. Indians, Africans, and Portuguese produced a substantial mixed race population. The southern colonies were mostly European because European women had joined the colonial migration to North America at an early date. And I put the Dominican Republic dull because they're mixed of multiple races, and so they don't really have certain race specifically. So next slide.
Differences in slavery between North America and the sugar colonies. By the time of the Civil War, almost all slaves in North America had been born there. But in Brazil, large imports still came in to make up for so many that were being voluntarily set free. Free slaves in Brazil also had more economic opportunities than the free slaves in North America. They could be political leaders, artists, musicians, and scholars, and even slave catchers. Racism in Brazil wasn't gone, but it was much less harsh than in North America. In North America, if you were even 1% Black, you were considered Black. In the sugar colonies, if you weren't a great part Black, you were put into a mixed category. Generally, skin color in North America was a much larger criterion for class status than in Brazil. In Brazil, a light-skinned mulatto with some wealth or education might pass as white.
All right.
Okay, so we did settler colonies in North America by Josiah, me, Carson, and Ben. So the definition of the settler colonies, they were imperial territories in which Europeans settled permanently in substantial numbers. It was used in reference to the European empires in the Americas, generally and particularly to the British colonies of North America. The majority of these colonies lacked the wealth and sophisticated cultures of the Spanish, and they remained far less prominent until the 18th century. There were multiple differences between the British settler colonies in North America and their counterparts in Latin America, especially Spain. The British had a self-government system, were resistant to royal governors, and were much more educated. And in comparison, they came from a culture that evolved more rapidly than those from an ardently Catholic, semi-feudal Spain. And then that picture on the right there, it's just of the colonization of Americas. So the various territories, the Spanish territory is in the green, and then the British territory is in the red.
Okay, good. And that map will change too over time, just so you guys know. That map changes. The French really lose out in a lot of ways on their some of their territories after the French and Indian Wars. We know it here. So.
Who came? Britain came and settled in New England, New York, and Pennsylvania in 1620 to 1681. Britain started its colonial ventures in the 1700s to find and explore even more new land. The Dutch originally owned New York, buying it in 1626, but the English took it and renamed it in 1664. Spanish settlers also came to the Americas later, but the British were... Okay, this is meant to phrase it like the Spanish were outnumbered 5-1 by the British, but I kind of switched that up in 1750. At the end of the American Revolution, America was populated by 90% Europeans. Spain was more interested in spreading Catholicism amongst the Native Americans with Christianity. Then the English were causing a steady flow of missionaries. 75% of American males could read, with the female percentage being a bit lower, while even with the Bible and 300 years of church, 95% of Latin Americans were illiterate. In the top right corner, there's a picture of Spanish missionaries, and the background is a picture of the Pilgrims coming.
When did they come? The first colony to come to America was the Pilgrims in 1607, when they left their land because of religious persecution. Many more colonies came all the way till the 1730s, when the final colony of Georgia settled.
Why did they come? Quakers from Pennsylvania and Puritans from Massachusetts traveled not to recreate the European society in a different area, but to change it in its aspects, which basically means it's the old rules. They didn't support those, and they wanted to recreate a new and updated society. Many traveled to the new land to escape religious persecution. Yeah, many were being killed off from that. The British came from a rapidly changing society, which allows them to bring new cultures and religions to the new societies. And lastly, most traveled to the new land in hopes to gain wealth and live a better life.
Okay, so a part of this, guys, is we have two different groups that do come. Puritans are one of them. They come to purify the Church of England, and there are others who come to